It's Luke Evans next. Apologies, Luke.
Thank you, Chair. One thing we do have control over in an emergency is the way in which we communicate. Arguably, that's your strongest suit, given your track record with Brexit. What would you score the government out of 10 on its communication, both to the NHS and to the public? 10 being this is gold standard, or 0 being the lesson learned, we should never do this again?
I think that so some of the people working on the communications were some of the best people in the world, and one of the great myths about the whole thing is that the reason for all of these problems was bad communications. Fundamentally, the reason for all these problems was bad policy, bad decisions, bad planning, bad operational capability. It doesn't matter if you've got great people doing communications if the Prime Minister changes his mind 10 times a day and then calls up the media and contradicts his own policy day after day after day. You're going to have a communications disaster zone. A few things are discussed more inaccurately than communications. So inevitably, there were certainly mistakes made on communications for sure. But all the big things that people think, why did that go wrong? Why did that go wrong? Like, for example, the whole thing with Rashford. The Director of Communications said to the Prime Minister twice, do not pick a fight with Rashford. Obviously, we should do this instead. The Prime Minister decided to pick a fight and then surrendered twice. After that, everyone says, oh, well, your communications are stupid. No. What's stupid is picking a fight with Rashford over school meals, and what should have happened is just getting the school meals policy right. So it's easy to blame communications for bad policy and bad decision making.
Let me pick you up on that, because no plan, stands the test of time when it hits the enemy. This was a novel virus, but the benefit you have in communications is we went into a second lockdown. So what were the lessons learned from communicating in the first lockdown that came out to play in the second lockdown? And looking at that, there was a third one which you weren't involved in, but I'd be interested in your lessons learned, because that's what the essence of this inquiry is about.
I think the same thing happened in the autumn as happened in January. It was bad policy and bad decisions. The problems in the autumn were not fundamentally communications problems. They were that the Prime Minister made some terrible decisions and got things wrong and then constantly U-turned on everything. That's not a communications failure. You see it, everyone in the outside world sees it as a communications failure, but the reality is it's much more fundamental than that. The autumn disasters were fundamentally not communications problems. The communications problems were a consequence of bad decisions and bad management.
So were you in charge of the communications at this point? Are you saying this isn't my problem, Gov, it's what I was given?
No, I mean, as I said earlier on, I had the only time between the election and leaving Number 10 that I was really engaged with communications at all was the period kind of late February until me and the Prime Minister becoming ill being tested positive on the Friday, that kind of 3 to 4 week period. Both before that and after that, I was very little involved with communications because I fundamentally disagreed with the Prime Minister on what is good communications, how to do communications, how it should be structured, how we should approach the media. On pretty much every single major thing, he and I completely disagreed. So I tried to use my time where I thought it could be better spent. For example, in the autumn, I spent, literally near zero time on communications and huge amounts of time on mass testing and on the defence review and on the economy and other things like that, procurement reform, etc., etc.
How well were you involved in the lockdown measures draw up, and what was your understanding of the lockdown measures?
Which one, sorry, which one are you talking about? In March or?
First one.
I was heavily involved in the period between, if you're talking about the communication of the lockdown measures kind of between trying to formulate Plan B on the 13th and then actually doing lockdown 10 days later, do you mean then?
Well, the understanding for the public when the measures came out over what's involved in the what you can do, why we keep 2 meters apart, who can go to what, when we can go to school, what understanding did you have that of where we can travel?
Yeah, I was heavily involved with that, but again, the problem there was not. I had all the communications people were screaming. We haven't got anything to explain to the public properly, or what we have got is all contradictory because we haven't got an actual plan. That was the problem. The problem wasn't in the communications team. The problem was what they were being given.
Okay. I'm moving on to a second point, and it's to pick you up on your evidence you gave at the start. At 11:09, you said to the member for Salford and Eccles, "It's completely crazy that I should be in such a senior position." You also then said you realised this was a massive problem, and yet you didn't take action. Why didn't you resign straight away? Or why you had the power to hire? Why didn't you hire your replacement? And did you say to the PM that you didn't feel you were competent?
So I did hire various people into Number 10 to try and raise the quality of the team there, including myself. For example, bringing in people like Tom Shinner, we built the analytical private office in there. There were lots of different people I brought in to try and provide expertise and skills that I didn't have and which also didn't exist in Number 10. And that did actually help. So in January, when I did that blog saying, Number 10 doesn't have these skills, we need to hire people, by September, we had built that team, and it did make a huge difference, and I think we'll come on to in terms of the September decisions. Terrible decisions were made, but they were made for completely different reasons than they were made in March. By then, there was a different set of skills and a different set of people. In terms of why should I have resigned, as I said, arguably I should have resigned in March, arguably I should have resigned in May, and I should definitely have resigned in September.
So in answer to that question, I'm just wondering where you draw the line on your personal responsibility in the decisions that are made. You said you didn't speak up because you were worried about the fact that you might be getting it wrong and people may die. There was a certain infamous trip, and that had huge influence on how people perceived the lockdown. Again, you said it was the problem of the policy, not in the way in which it was messaged across. Where do you draw the line for you having personal responsibility for the decisions both in government and about the way you conduct yourself?
So I think I should probably explain some things about this that were not put into the public domain at the time in the Rose Garden, because that whole episode was definitely a major disaster for the government and for the COVID policy. So I'll explain something about it and then and why we got things so wrong. In autumn 2019, I had to move out of my house because of security threats for about 6 weeks. On the 28th of February, when I was dealing with the COVID problem, on the Friday night, I was down in Westminster, and my wife called saying there's a gang of people outside saying they're going to break into the house and kill everybody inside. She was alone at the house at the time with our then 3-year-old. After that, I spoke to the PM and the Deputy Cabinet Secretary, Helen McNamara, about the situation, and it was suggested that possibly I either move my family into a government accommodation or move them off to family. On the 22nd of March, the story happened which the lady mentioned earlier about that fake quote from me basically implying that I was happy for everyone to die, which led to further problems. After that weekend, I then said to my wife, right, we've been discussing it for a month. We've got to get out of here on Friday. So before the whole thing happened with the Prime Minister being sick, my wife calling up on the Friday and everything else, it had already been decided that I was going to move my family out of London, regardless of the COVID rules. That was discussed with people in the Cabinet Office and with the private office. Now, what happened is, because of this, we kept the whole thing very quiet. Almost nobody in Number 10 knew about it for obvious reasons, because I didn't want the same problems to pop up at my parents' house up in Durham. When the story then came out, the Prime Minister and I agreed, when the first story came out about me, much of the story was completely wrong. It suggested that the police had spoken to me about my behaviour because of the lockdown rules and whatnot, which was completely false. The police had only spoken to me about security issues, but the media presented it as if I'd been talked to by the police for breaking lockdown rules. The whole story was crazy. The Prime Minister and I agreed that because of the security things, we would basically just stonewall the story and not say anything about it. And, you know, I was extremely mindful of the problem that when you talk about these things, you cause more trouble for yourself. And I'd already put my wife and child in the firing line on it. So I said, I'm not talking about this, we should shut our mouths about it, and the media stories are all basically, loads of it is wrong, and ignore it. Prime Minister agreed. Then on the Monday, he was under so much political pressure and media pressure that he said, this line won't hold, we're going to have to do something about it. Now, at this point, I made just a terrible mistake, which I'm extremely sorry about. What I should have done, in retrospect, is I should have called my wife and said, listen, you and our boy are going to have to get out of London again. I'm going to have to just explain the truth about this whole thing. Get out of London, we'll hold a press conference. Instead of that, we had a kind of chaotic situation in Number 10 where the Prime Minister said, we're going to have to do something, you're going to have to explain something. And I said, I'm not explaining these security things, otherwise I'm going to have everyone mobs back outside my house. So I ended up giving the whole Rose Garden thing, where what I said was true, but we left out a kind of crucial part of it all. And it just, the whole thing was a complete disaster. And the truth is, and then it undermined public confidence in the whole thing. The truth is, when the Prime Minister said on the Monday, we can't hold this line, we're going to have to explain things, if I just basically sent my family back out of London and said, here's the truth to the public, I think people would have understood the situation, and it was a terrible misjudgment not to do that. So I take, the Prime Minister got that wrong, I got that wrong. We both made a terrible horlicks of it in a very odd circumstance on the Monday. So that hopefully explains that situation and makes clear that I know that my misjudgment on it caused huge trouble. And I deeply apologise for it.
Thank you, Mr Cummings, and I'm sorry that you felt threats to your family and indeed to yourself and your safety. No one should feel that. However, this is about lessons learned. One is they're talking about coming forward and giving the truth. The second is, with regards to that, where do you see your personal responsibility on this, the media's responsibility on it, and government's responsibility to looking after the people who are being representative and making these tough decisions in a world emergency?
Do you mean specifically on this particular episode, or do you mean in general?
Yeah, this particular episode, because what we don't want to happen is something like this happen again that undermines public confidence. If there's ever to be another pandemic, we need to learn the lessons so that these situations are avoided.
I think a fundamental lesson of it is the same as the fundamental lesson on Sage and so many things, that openness is better. Like, essentially, we took the decision because of the security problem, and I didn't want to go through the whole thing of moving my family again and everything else. And I felt guilty about the whole thing as well with my wife. Fundamentally, that was a terrible mistake, though. It would have been much better just to come clean on the whole thing, tell the truth about it at the time, and then I think it wouldn't have been the fiasco that it became. So I guess the fundamental lesson is the default on everything should be openness. If we defaulted to that on this, it would have been harder for me in some ways, but it would have been better for the country, and that's what we should have done.
Thank you. Thank you, Luke.
Thank you very much.